Okay. So, one of the things that you'll notice happens a lot if you're looking at election fraud, truth, or propaganda is they go very far out of their way to attack media outlets and to attack fact checkers. And it's pretty obvious to see why that is. If you want to lie to somebody, that's what you want to do is attack anybody who might be offering any kind of counter narrative. And so that's one of the things that just happens a lot when you talk to election fraud truthers is you can't use any source. You can't point them to any kind of media source because they'll just say no, they're lying, um, regardless of what it is. And, in some ways, this is kind of a new problem. In some ways, it isn't. Like, 'cause they've always kind of the kind of people who became election fraud truthers, a lot of them, they've always kind of hated New York Times. They've always hated Huffington Post. But what's fairly new is to them for them to dismiss out of hand pretty much everything, even something as tepid and uncontroversial as USA Today or like a nonpartisan fact checking site like factcheck.org or even like right leaning media sources like Forbes that just don't happen to play into their particular alternate reality. So it's hard to understate the seriousness of this problem, right? How do any of us know anything beyond what we see with our own eyes, like in our own lives and the couple of blocks where we happen to live? We see people reporting on it, right? I know when there is a hurricane coming about to hit Louisiana, even though I live in New York, because, I turn on the news and see a meteorologist reporting on it. I know what the NFL standings are at any given point in the season, not because I've seen every game, but because I can go to Yahoo Sports and look up the standings. And to think at all about what's going on in the world beyond your experience, you kind of have to take some things on trust. So it's a real problem, but I think the thing to tell, election fraud truthers to kind of circumvent this, at least in the short term, because it is their media illiteracy is a problem in and of itself, but at least in the short term, when it comes to election fraud truthism, is you can tell them to look at the primary texts, the primary sources, because, in that sense, you don't have to take the media's word for anything. And in this case, the primary texts I'm talking about are the court documents, particularly the judge's decisions, because there's a few reasons. First of all, those are a lot of this stuff is public. There's actually a Wikipedia page specifically for the presidential election 2020 lawsuits. And it's one of those things where if you go to the Wikipedia page, you scroll to the bottom, pretty much everything you could want is there in PDF format that you can just click on and it pops up. And, yeah, if you wanted to read all this stuff, it would take a very long time. That's part of the reason I would recommend prioritizing the judge's decisions. But, you could go through all of it. And one of the great things about this is that even like the worst lawyers, even the most unscrupulous or incompetent lawyers, know that you can't just lie to a judge. You can't present knowingly fraudulent evidence to a judge, right? Because just the penalties of doing that are just so steep that a lot of people just wouldn't touch it. So in that sense, the court system kind of forces plaintiffs to be honest a little bit, or at least more honest than propagandists are when they're just talking to the public. But I think it's also the case that one of these arguments you'll hear from truthers is when you bring up the horrendous legal record, when you bring up just how pretty much all 60 some of these lawsuits have failed, they'll say that was because of technicalities. Um, no, you would need a very, very loose definition of the term technicality to believe that. And yeah, look, there are instances of judges um, mentioning that the suit seems to be being filed in the wrong court or that the timing seems to be wrong. But no, in a lot of other cases, it's just the evidence doesn't warrant what you're asking for. Look at the King versus Whitmer judge's decision. The judge in that case is basically like, yeah, you're asking me to overturn the will of Michigan's voters by fiat because you have a signed affidavit of someone saying they believe that poll workers were switching votes. No, belief isn't evidence. And it's a lot of stuff like that. But one of the earliest things I found was I was looking at one of the cases really early that happened in Pennsylvania. You had a conflict where a poll watcher came into a Pennsylvania polling site, and they had a barrier up. I think um, partly because of COVID, partly because of like security reasons. But like the poll watcher complained that they weren't allowed to be close enough to the people who were processing the mail-in ballots. And the reason that one got a little bit contentious is because I think the law didn't actually explicitly say um, how specifically how close poll watchers need to be to what poll workers are doing, what specifically they need to be able to see. Um, just my 2 cents on that. I would assume that you know the fact that they aren't allowed to actually watch people vote, it would follow from that they actually aren't allowed to see what's on a ballot, any information that could tell them what somebody did. That's just my 2 cents. But when you actually look at what happened, how it went back and forth, it's like, okay, well, just compromise, let them be within 6 feet instead of having to be 15 feet away, and them later taking an issue with that as well. Whatever you think was right or wrong in that situation, in that particular conflict, that's a million miles away from what the propagandists were saying about uh, what they were claiming happened in Pennsylvania, which is that poll watchers just weren't allowed in; they weren't allowed to see anything, and even that's a million miles away from evidence that there was fraud. So, like I said, just try to get them to look at the primary texts, try to get them to look at these legal documents, look at these judges' decisions, actually go through like the texts that document what happened and what kind of evidence can actually be offered and what judges were actually making of it and why no, it was not technicalities. And I think that also kind of signals to them that you're not trusting the media, that you're capable of looking at like everything you need to look at. So yeah, hopefully that helps. That's probably one of the best ways to approach it when you're talking to a friend or family member and you know they're like, oh, you trust the media, you shouldn't trust the media. It's like, no, look at the primary texts.